Let's add this backdrop, and let's first of all create the backdrop component and add the styling for the backdrop. So let's head over to our UI folder and the backdrop, and let's start working on that backdrop component. It'll be a super simple component. As always, it's a functional component here, which receives some props and returns some JSX. It therefore also needs to import React from React, and it needs to export itself as the default. Now, in the JSX code I return, I don't actually even need to write complex code. I just want to check if props show is true. If that is the case, again using a ternary expression here, if that is the case, then I want to return a div. This div will simply hold the styling for the backdrop. Otherwise, I will return null. You may return null in components. That is okay. It just means nothing gets rendered, but it is okay. Now, I don't need to pass any content to the div. I need to set up some styling though. So let's add a backdrop.css file where we add some styling for the backdrop. And we can quickly write this together. Let's add the backdrop CSS class so that we can use this through CSS modules. And the backdrop should span the full height and width of the page to cover everything. It should have a fixed position so that it stays in position even as we scroll. It should have a set index of, let's say, 100 so that it is above the elements we want to have it sit above. And this will become important later once we add a toolbar, for example. But if we check out the modal styling, you will see it also has a set index of 500. That's of course important. The modal needs to sit above the backdrop, and the backdrop will later need to sit above some other elements like the toolbar. Let's also add left 0 and top 0 to position it in the top left corner. And let's add a background color where I will use a RGBA value to set this to a black color with 50% transparency. Now it's time to import these classes, these classes, or this single class actually, into the backdrop component. So here I will therefore simply import classes from /backdrop CSS and assign this as a class name to the div. So class name is now equal to classes backdrop with a capital B. That's important. With that, we get a backdrop component. Now we need to use it. It expects to get a show property. The question now is, where do we add this backdrop? And now you can have multiple places where you could add it, where you could argue that it makes sense. One such place would be in the app component. Have it sit next to the layout, outside of the layout even, because it's not part of the core page content. Have it sit in the layout component, could you argue, because it is part of the page, but it should not be part of the main content and not be part of the toolbar or anything like that. You can definitely do that. You can put it into the layout component. You just need to make sure that you then can reach that by passing the show the backdrop state up to that component and so on. This is a nice challenge for you. Try placing and handling the backdrop in different places of your app. For that, you might also have to switch some components from stateless functional components to class-based components, because maybe all of a sudden you need to define some method in a component. I will go for another approach though. I will add the backdrop to my modal, because in my opinion, this backdrop is closely connected to the modal. If the modal is shown, the backdrop should be shown. So therefore, I will import my auxiliary component here, because I need to place that modal next to the backdrop. So let me simply go up all the way to the place where I can access HOC and then my auxiliary. And now let's wrap the div of the modal into this aux component. And let's now import the backdrop into this file too. Import backdrop from the backdrop folder, the backdrop.js file. Let's place it next to the modal. This is my backdrop. Now we should configure the show property on the backdrop because we expect it in there. And thankfully we get the show information on props in the modal component itself. So we can simply pass on props show to the backdrop. If the modal is shown, the backdrop should be shown. If we do this, let's save all the files and let's see if that works. Looks good, we got a backdrop. Let's now make sure that we can click this backdrop too. For that, we of course need to add a click listener inside the backdrop on the div. So on click should execute some method, and of course we'll receive a reference to that method on a property. So I'll execute props, and then let's say clicked could be the property name. You can choose any name you want here. Let's now go back to the modal. Here we have to provide a clicked property, and now we have to do something there. And I will simply trigger a prop on that modal, which should be modal closed. So modal closed is now a property we have to add to the modal component when we add it to JSX, to our output, so to say. And we do of course use that modal in the burger builder here. So what we now need to do is we have to add this modal closed property to modal because we just added it in there as a reference of the method we want to execute once the backdrop fire is clicked, just to reassure that it is clear when this happens, which happens when on click is fired on the div which makes up the backdrop. So in Burger Builder, where we in the end will get this information, I want to execute some code once this backdrop was clicked in the end. And I will add a new handler, the purchase cancel handler, because clicking the backdrop essentially means that we want to close the modal and that we want to cancel the purchase. We don't want to continue. So I will call this set state and set purchasing to false. Notice the special syntax I'm using here again to make sure this inside of this method refers to the class and not to something else. So it's the purchase cancel handler I want to execute once the modal was closed. So this purchase cancel handler. If we now save everything and we go back to the application and we open the modal, we see it. If I click the backdrop, you see the modal disappears and the backdrop disappears. And we can do this as often as we want. This, by the way, is a super tasty burger. No meat, but a lot of cheese. Delicious. Now let's continue and let's make sure we add some buttons as part of the order summary so that we may continue or that we may cancel.